The early morning sky was a blur of steel and fire. Dawn had barely broken when the roar of Allied aircraft filled the horizon, their engines like the angry growl of some mechanical beast. Below, the cliffs of Normandy stretched endlessly, jagged and silent, the ground smeared with smoke and the scent of gunpowder. Private Thomas Hartley pressed his back against the cold earth of a foxhole, gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white. At 19, Thomas had never imagined war would be this loud, or this silent. In the deafening chaos of artillery and bombs, there was a strange stillness, a momentary pause between destruction and survival. He drew a deep breath, tasting mud, sweat, and fear. Beside him, the earth trembled under the thudding of shells, each strike closer than the last. "Move," a voice hissed. Thomas turned to see Corporal Jean Moreau, a French resistance fighter, emerging from the fogged hedgerows. Jean's face was streaked with date, his eyes sharp and calculating, a map clutched in one hand and a pistol in the other. "German patrol ahead. We can't be seen." Thomas nodded, though his stomach twisted. The hedgerows were a labyrinth, and every shadow seemed to hide death. He followed Jean, each step deliberate, his boots sinking into mud, branches scratching his arms. The landscape was scarred, barns reduced to rubble, trees snapped in half, craters pocked across fields like some grotesque pattern. As they advanced, Thomas caught a glimpse of movement in the smoke, a group of paratroopers descending from the sky, their white chutes blooming like flowers in reverse. Some landed awkwardly, tumbling into the mud, while others hit the ground running, rifles ready. The air was filled with their shouts, commands, and the distant crackle of machine guns. Thomas's heart pounded so violently he thought it might give him away, but Jean pressed a hand to his shoulder. "Steady. Observe first, move second." They ducked behind a fallen wall and watched the chaos unfold. Thomas's eyes landed on a ruined farmhouse ahead. Its windows were shattered, doors hanging from rusted hinges, and smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a ghostly reminder that people once lived here, laughed here, before the war took everything. Jean gestured. "We go inside. Quick. There may be supplies. There may be maps." The farmhouse smelled of smoke, mildew, and despair. Dust hung in the air like tiny particles of memory, illuminated by the weak morning light sneaking through gaps in the walls. Broken furniture lay strewn about, papers scattered like leaves in a storm. And there, on a splintered table, was a map marked with lines, notes, and sketches of troop movements. Thomas swallowed hard. "Is this German?" he whispered. Jean shook his head. "Resistance intel. French. Whoever was here knew what they were doing." Thomas's gaze fell on a small wooden box on the floor. Inside were supplies, bandages, canned food, ammunition. The simple things that could mean life or death in these fields. He stuffed some into his pack, grateful for the brief reprieve. For a moment, they rested. Thomas pulled a folded letter from his jacket, his mother's handwriting, smeared from rain and mud. His thumb brushed over the familiar loops, and he felt a pang of homesickness. He had left Liverpool just 6 months ago, thinking war would be a distant story told in newspapers. Now, the war was inside him, in every sound of gunfire, every shadow that moved too quickly. "Thomas," Jean said softly, breaking his reverie. "Look." Across the field, a group of German soldiers appeared, scanning the area cautiously. Thomas's pulse quickened. He could feel the rifle trembling in his hands. Jean whispered, "We wait. Then we move. No heroics. Not yet." The minutes stretched. The soldiers moved past the farmhouse, unaware of the pair hiding behind the rubble. Thomas exhaled, a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He realized something that few men could understand so young. Survival often demanded patience, not courage. Night fell like a velvet curtain, and the sounds of battle faded to distant echoes. Thomas and Jean huddled in the farmhouse, the cold seeping into their bones. Thomas took out his journal, scribbling by the light of a small lantern. "I thought war would be loud, but mostly it's silence, waiting, and hoping the next step doesn't end me. I can hear the planes overhead like ghosts. I can see the shadows of men moving, some to die, some to kill, some just to survive. Every breath feels borrowed." Jean watched him quietly. "You write well, Thomas. Maybe one day people will read this, see what we went through." Thomas didn't answer. He stared at the ceiling, imagining the lives that once existed in this shattered farmhouse, imagining himself back home, in a quiet room, far from the screams and smoke. He had joined the army to do his part, to save, to fight. Yet, staring at the broken walls, he wondered if he was just a pawn in a game too vast to comprehend. Outside, the wind carried the smell of gunpowder and wet earth. Somewhere in the distance, a plane roared overhead, a reminder that the battle was far from over. But for tonight, in this small ruined farmhouse, Thomas felt a fragile reprieve. He was alive, and that alone was a victory. As he finally closed his eyes, he could still hear the whispering skies, the planes, the distant guns, the ghosts of Normandy calling. And in the dark, he made a silent promise: he would survive. Not for glory, not for medals, but to see the world beyond these fields again, to live long enough to tell the story. The streets of London were deceptively calm. Outside, the city seemed almost ordinary. Children ran along pavements, street vendors shouted their wares, and the Thames reflected the muted gray of the summer sky. Yet beneath this normalcy, a war raged that few civilians could imagine. Inside Bletchley Park, the hum of typewriters and the low murmur of voices created a strange symphony. Rows of desks were cluttered with sheets of paper, decoding machines, and piles of unshuffled messages. Hey? The war was fought not with guns and tanks but with brains, intuition, and endless nights under flickering lamps. Evelyn Carter, a young cryptographer with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, stared at the stream of encrypted messages before her. She had been working around the clock, eyes burning, mind sharp and restless. For months, she had been cracking German codes, peeling back layer after layer of cipher to reveal the enemy's movements. Tonight, however, she had stumbled upon something different. Her fingers flew over the typewriter as she decoded a particularly stubborn message. Lines of seemingly random letters began to form coherent words: supply routes, troop movements, locations of armored divisions. And then there it was, a name that made her blood run cold: Project Natchfork. Evelyn's mind raced. She had seen many plans, many threats, but Natchfork was unlike anything she had encountered. Its complexity suggested a massive German counteroffensive, a move that could devastate Allied forces in Normandy if left unchecked. Her heart pounded, and she almost dropped the papers in her hands. "Miss Carter," a voice asked. She looked up to see Commander Hastings, a stern man with graying hair, leaning over her shoulder. "What have you found?" Evelyn swallowed. It's big. Larger than we expected. Natchfork, there's a German offensive planned. They are moving heavy artillery and troops toward Normandy. If we don't warn the field operatives, thousands could die." Commander Hastings nodded slowly, the weight of responsibility heavy in his eyes. "Prepare a coded message for the field. Make sure it reaches the resistance teams and our operatives immediately. Lives depend on it." Evelyn worked quickly, encrypting the details of the plan into layers of code that only the trained operatives could understand. Sweat ran down her back as she double-checked every line. One mistake, one misinterpreted word, and the message could fall into the wrong hands, or worse, be ignored. By midnight, the message was ready. She handed it to a courier, a young man with nerves of steel and a determined expression. "Deliver this to the operatives in France," she instructed. "Tell them to trust it. It's our only warning." Meanwhile, across the channel, Thomas and Jean were unaware of the storm gathering in London. The hedgerows and ruined farmhouses of Normandy had provided temporary safety, but the war was far from over. Their mission, small in the grand scheme, was about to intersect with something far larger than either of them could imagine. Jean glanced at Thomas as they moved cautiously through a quiet village. "The resistance network is active here. We should contact our liaison." Thomas nodded, his fingers brushing over the letter from his mother tucked in his jacket. He had been carrying it like a talisman, a fragile piece of home amid the destruction. But tonight, he realized that letters could only do so much. The real messages that mattered were those hidden in codes, carried across the sea, and placed in the hands of those who understood their weight. They reached the safe house, a small, abandoned bakery on the edge of town. The smell of stale bread mingled with dust and decay, but it was safe for now. Inside, maps were spread across a wooden table, and a dim lantern cast flickering shadows across the walls. Thomas leaned over the maps, trying to memorize troop movements, supply lines, and points of strategic importance. Jean was tense, scanning the street through a cracked window. "Something is coming," he muttered. He didn't know what, but he trusted instincts honed by months of guerrilla warfare. "Be ready. This may not be as simple as it seems." Hours passed. The moon rose, casting a silver glow over the ruined village. And then the message arrived. A courier, exhausted but determined, slipped through the door, placing a sealed envelope on the table. Jean picked it up, breaking the seal carefully. Inside, the coded instructions revealed the location and timing of a German ambush, information that could save hundreds of lives. Thomas read the message, eyes wide. This could prevent an attack. "We have to get this to the Allied forces immediately." Jean nodded grimly. "We will. But it won't be easy. Nachtfork is not a small operation. Whoever planned this has resources, intelligence, and reach. We're stepping into the shadow of something far bigger than Normandy's hedgerows." That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The safe house was quiet, yet the weight of the message pressed heavily on him. He imagined the soldiers on the front lines, unaware of the danger lurking in the plans they hadn't seen. He thought of his mother, of home, of the fragile thread of life he clung to. And he realized that courage wasn't just facing enemy fire, it was carrying knowledge that could change the fate of countless lives. Evelyn, thousands of miles away, sat in the quiet of Bletchley Park, staring at a map of Europe spread across a desk. She had sent the message, but she knew that sending it was only the first step. The true challenge lay in those who would receive it, operatives in enemy territory, in forests, villages, and ruins, who had to act without hesitation. Lives hung in the balance, and every second mattered. As dawn approached in Normandy, Thomas and Jean prepared to move. The farmhouse, the hedgerows, the quiet villages, they were no longer merely obstacles or shelter. They were the stages upon which the next act of the war would unfold. And in the shadow of those skies, with planes roaring and unseen enemies waiting, Thomas realized that survival and victory were not separate. They were intertwined, delicate as a letter in the wind, fragile as hope itself. He looked at Jean, who tightened the straps on his pack. "Ready?" Jean asked. Thomas nodded, gripping his rifle. "Ready." Outside, the wind carried the faintest whisper of airplanes and distant gunfire. Somewhere in the sky, the shadow of Nachtfork loomed. And somewhere in the chaos of war, the tiniest spark of courage could light a path toward survival. The hedgerows of Normandy were silent, but the air was thick with tension. Thomas and Jean moved cautiously, their boots sinking into the damp soil, rifles ready. The coded message from London burned in Jean's pocket, a lifeline that could prevent disaster, but only if they reached their destination. The morning mist clung to the trees, twisting the hedgerows into a maze of shadows. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, set Thomas's nerves on edge. He had faced fear before, but today it felt different, more personal. Today, the danger wasn't just abstract, it was immediate, tangible, and deadly. Jean held up a hand, signaling to stop. From the corner of his eye, Thomas saw movement ahead, figures emerging from the mist. Soldiers, heavily armed, advancing silently. His heart jumped into his throat. "Ambush," he whispered. Jean nodded grimly. "We knew it was coming. Stay low, follow my lead." They dropped to the ground as machine gun fire erupted. The sound was deafening, shattering the quiet and splintering the earth around them. Bullets tore through hedgerows, and Thomas felt a sharp sting as dirt and debris hit his face. The world became a blur of smoke, mud, and chaos. Thomas's mind raced. He remembered the young paratroopers he had seen descending days before, the ones who had tumbled into mud, terrified and unprepared. Now he understood their fear all too well. Survival required more than courage. It required split-second decisions, instincts honed by desperation. Jean crawled forward, pulling Thomas along. They reached a shallow ditch, barely large enough to shield them from the bullets tearing through the hedgerows. Thomas's hands were trembling, not from cold but from adrenaline, and for a moment, he felt the weight of mortality pressing down on him. Through the smoke, Thomas noticed a young German soldier, no older than himself, frozen in fear. His rifle shook in his hands, and his eyes darted nervously. Thomas felt a strange connection, a flash of recognition. The boy was as terrified as he was, a mirror of his own vulnerability. Jean hissed, "Don't think, move." They advanced carefully, using the ditch and fallen branches for cover. Each step was a gamble, each breath could be their last. Bullets whizzed past, kicking up mud and splintering wood. Thomas felt his stomach tighten with every explosion, yet he moved forward, driven by instinct and the knowledge that the lives of countless soldiers depended on their success. They reached the edge of the ambush zone, but the cost was high. Behind them, several of their comrades had fallen, resistance fighters who had trusted in courage and been repaid with death. Thomas swallowed hard. The image of their lifeless bodies seared into his mind. War was not fair. It was merciless. And yet, life demanded moving forward. Jean paused, catching his breath. "We've delayed them. Now we need to get this intel to the Allied command." Thomas nodded. The message from London was more than paper. It was the key to survival. They had to deliver it, no matter the danger. Yet as they ran, dodging sniper fire and hidden mines, Thomas couldn't shake the image of the young German soldier. In that moment, he understood a grim truth. Enemies were not always monsters. Sometimes, they were just boys caught in circumstances beyond their control. The battle dragged on, a relentless storm of fire and smoke. Thomas felt exhaustion pulling at him, but he ignored it. He couldn't afford weakness, not now, not when so much depended on their mission. Jean's voice guided him, steady and commanding, as they navigated the treacherous terrain. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached a small ridge overlooking a valley. Below, Allied forces were regrouping, preparing for the counterattack that the intel would make possible. Thomas handed the coded message to a waiting officer, who took it with a grim nod. "This will save lives," he said. "You've done well." For a moment, Thomas allowed himself to breathe. The immediate danger had passed. Yet he felt no triumph, only a hollow ache for the comrades left behind. War demanded sacrifice, but it demanded conscience too, a conscience that weighed heavily on those who survived while others fell. As they rested in the valley, Thomas took a moment to look back at the misty hedgerows. The landscape that had seemed so familiar was now transformed into a memory of chaos, fear, and fleeting courage. He realized that every step in this war was a choice, every action carried consequences, and survival was as much about moral judgment as physical endurance. Jean rested beside him, wiping sweat and grime from his face. "You did well," he said softly. "But the war isn't over. Not by a long shot." Thomas nodded. He knew Jean was right. They had survived the ambush, but Nachfork was still out there, a looming shadow over Normandy. The mission that began in a ruined farmhouse, guided by a letter and a coded message from London, was far from finished. That night, under a sky lit by distant artillery fire, Thomas wrote again in his journal. "Today, I saw death and fear face to face. I saw boys my age, on both sides, trembling in the dirt. War is not about glory, it is about choices. The choice to live, to fight, to protect those who cannot protect themselves. I survived today, but survival feels like a debt I cannot yet repay." As the moon rose, casting pale light over the battlefield, Thomas and Jean prepared to move again. The war had many layers, many shadows, and they had only just begun to navigate them. The real test was still ahead, and survival would demand more than courage. It would demand cunning, trust, and the strength to act in the darkness. Outside, the hedgerows whispered in the night wind, carrying with them the ghosts of those lost, and the silent promise of battles yet to come. Thomas closed his eyes, listening, and understood something profound. Even in chaos, even in fear, the smallest acts of courage could shape history. The streets of Paris were alive with whispers. Rumors of liberation mingled with caution, and the air smelled of smoke, dust, and the faint sweetness of crushed flowers in the city gardens. Thomas and Jean moved cautiously through narrow alleyways, their boots echoing softly on cobblestone. Every shadow felt alive, every window a potential threat. After surviving the deadly ambush in Normandy, they were now tasked with delivering critical intelligence about Project Nachfork. The coded message from London had guided them through forests and villages, across battle-scarred fields, and into the heart of occupied France. Their mission was simple in theory: contact a liaison in Paris, deliver the message, and help prevent a catastrophic German counterattack. In practice, it was anything but simple. The contact was a man named Marcel, a well-dressed resistance coordinator known for his connections throughout the city. He had promised shelter, safe passage, and access to resources necessary to transmit the intelligence to Allied forces. Thomas and Jean approached the designated safe house, a quiet, ivy-covered building tucked between two crumbling apartment blocks. Marcel greeted them with a polite nod. "Welcome," he said smoothly, his voice warm, his eyes betraying nothing. "I've been expecting you. You have the documents." Jean handed over the sealed envelope, watching Marcel's hands as he accepted it. There was a subtle hesitation, almost imperceptible, but enough to make Jean uneasy. Thomas, still shaken from the ambush, felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Something about Marcel didn't feel right. "Excellent," Marcel said, breaking the seal and scanning the papers quickly. "This is exactly what we need." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You two must stay. Paris is no longer entirely safe, and the Germans have eyes everywhere." They settled into the safe house, a modest apartment with peeling wallpaper and sparse furniture. As night fell, Thomas noticed movement outside the windows, figures lingering in the shadows. He whispered to Jean, "I don't trust him." Jean nodded. "Neither do I. Stay alert." Hours passed. The city hummed with the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional crackle of gunfire. Thomas tried to focus on the maps, tracing supply routes and enemy positions, but the unease gnawed at him. Then, late in the night, Jean's instincts proved correct. Marcel was not alone. Through a crack in the floorboards, Jean and Thomas saw him meeting with another figure, someone known to collaborate with German sympathizers. The documents, the intelligence, they were being sold to the highest bidder. Betrayal. After everything Thomas and Jean had endured, the hedgerows, the ambush, the perilous journey across France, their mission was on the verge of collapse. Jean whispered, "We have to act. Now." Thomas's hands shook, but he nodded. They couldn't allow Nachtfolk to fall into enemy hands. Every life at the front depended on it. Quietly, they crept through the apartment, careful not to alert Marcel. They grabbed copies of the stolen documents and prepared to slip out through the back exit. The night air hit them like a wall as they emerged onto the deserted street. The city was silent, but danger lurked in every shadow. Jean led the way, Thomas close behind, clutching the precious intel. They moved like ghosts, weaving through alleyways and abandoned courtyards, aware that any wrong step could be fatal. As they paused in a quiet square to catch their breath, Thomas's thoughts raced. He thought of the men and women fighting across France, the lives saved by the intelligence they now carried. He thought of the fallen comrades in Normandy and the young German soldier whose fear had mirrored his own. War was a tangled web of morality, courage, and survival, and betrayal cut deeper than any bullet. Hours later, they reached a hidden safe house used by the True Resistance Network. The leader, an older woman named Colette, accepted the documents with a grim nod. "You've done well. Nachtfolk must be stopped. Too many lives depend on this." Thomas felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The betrayal of Marcel lingered like a shadow, a reminder that even in a war fought for justice, human greed and fear could poison the cause. He realized that victory wasn't just about defeating the enemy. It was about discernment, trust, and navigating the moral gray that war forced upon everyone. That night, Thomas finally allowed himself to rest. He wrote in his journal, "Tonight, I saw the darkness that lives within men. Not all enemies wear uniforms. Some smile while selling death for profit. We risked our lives for something greater than ourselves, yet I feel the weight of the betrayal. War is more than battle. It is shadow and conscience, courage and deception. I survived today, but the lessons will haunt me." Jean watched Thomas quietly. "Tomorrow, we move again," he said softly. "The war is far from over. Nachtfolk still looms, and Paris is no place for complacency." Thomas nodded, staring out at the quiet streets. The city slept, unaware of the treacheries that had unfolded in its heart. Yet he knew the coming days would demand more than courage. They would demand vigilance, cunning, and the ability to act when morality and survival collided. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees and along the cobblestone streets, carrying with it the echoes of betrayal, sacrifice, and hope. In the darkness, Thomas understood that war was not only fought on battlefields but in choices, in loyalty, and in the fragile human heart. And he promised himself that he would survive, not just for himself, but for the countless lives that depended on those choices. Winter had come with a vengeance. The Ardennes forest was cloaked in snow, the trees heavy with frost, their skeletal branches swaying in the icy wind. Thomas Hartley adjusted his pack and shivered, the cold biting through his jacket. Months of fighting had hardened him, but the winter of 1944 tested even the strongest soldiers. Jean Moreau trudged ahead, his face set in grim determination. "We're close," he said, voice muffled by a scarf. "The intel says the German strike is imminent. If Nachtfork succeeds, the Allies could lose hundreds, maybe thousands. We can't fail now." Thomas's hands ached as he gripped his rifle, his breath visible in the frigid air. Every step through the snow was exhausting, but he pressed on. He remembered Normandy, the ambush, the hedgerows, the fear in the eyes of a young German soldier. He remembered Paris, Marcel's betrayal, and the heavy responsibility of the documents he now carried. The war had changed him. Survival was no longer enough. Now, he fought to prevent devastation. The forest was silent, save for the occasional snap of a branch underfoot or the distant rumble of artillery. Visibility was low, and the enemy could be anywhere. They moved cautiously, scanning shadows for movement, hearts pounding with anticipation. Every noise was amplified. The crunch of snow, the whisper of wind, even the echo of distant gunfire seemed to signal danger. Suddenly, a flare illuminated the forest. Shadows leapt across the snow-covered ground, revealing German soldiers moving into position. Thomas dropped to the ground instinctively, pulling Jean with him behind a cluster of rocks. Bullets hissed through the air, and the scent of gunpowder stung their nostrils. "This is it," Jean whispered, scanning the positions. "We need to get the intel to command. They are counting on us." Thomas nodded, though fear clutched at his chest. They had faced ambushes before, but this was the culmination of months of struggle, the final push. They couldn't afford hesitation. Jean signaled, and they began crawling through the snow, using the terrain as cover, moving closer to a small ridge where Allied officers were coordinating the counterattack. A sudden explosion rocked the forest, sending snow and splinters of wood flying. Thomas felt the ground shake beneath him. He gritted his teeth, pushing forward, ignoring the sting of cold and the ache in his muscles. Every second counted. Every delay could cost lives. As they approached the ridge, Thomas spotted a German observation post. A young soldier, rifle in hand, scanned the area blindly. Thomas froze. For a moment, he saw the same fear he had seen months ago in Normandy, the terror mirrored across time and space. He hesitated, heart pounding. Then Jean nudged him forward. "We don't have time for hesitation. Move." They sprinted the last few yards, slipping into the cover of Allied positions. Officers took the documents, scanning the information with furrowed brows. Orders were issued immediately, artillery repositioned, troops redeployed. Thomas and Jean watched as the plan they had risked their lives to deliver began to unfold. Nachtfork's offensive was intercepted before it could strike devastatingly, thanks to the intelligence they carried. The battle raged in the distance. Artillery fire shook the trees, and the distant cries of soldiers filled the forest. Thomas realized that, despite the success of their mission, victory always came with a cost. He thought of the men lost in Normandy, the betrayed allies in Paris, and the countless lives hanging in the balance. War was a cruel teacher, offering no absolutes. Hours later, as the firing subsided and the snow settled, Thomas allowed himself to breathe. The immediate threat of Nachtfork had been neutralized. Allied forces would regroup, and countless lives were saved. Yet the shadow of loss lingered. He knew that survival did not erase the memories, nor the scars that war left on the soul. Jean clapped him on the shoulder. "We did it," he said quietly. "We've changed the course of this battle. For now." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of exhaustion and relief. He looked around at the Ardennes, the snow-dusted trees, the remnants of battle, and the soldiers moving among the wounded. War had tested him, shaped him, and scarred him. And through it all, he had learned that courage wasn't just about facing the enemy. It was about acting when stakes were highest, when lives depended on choices, and when the line between survival and duty blurred. That night, Thomas wrote once more in his journal, "The war is far from over, but today, we're struck a blow that matters. I've seen fear, betrayal, and death. I've seen courage, sacrifice, and hope. War is not clean, and victory is never absolute. Yet, even in the darkest forests, in the coldest winter, there is a path forward. We are shadows in a storm, but even shadows leave marks." Jean and Thomas sat by a small fire, the snow crunching under their boots, the forest silent but watchful. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new challenges, and new fears. But for tonight, they survived. And in that survival, they carried with them the knowledge that even in the chaos of war, their actions mattered. That even the smallest spark of courage could light a path through the darkest night. Outside, the wind swept through the Ardennes, whispering over snow-covered branches. The war continued, as relentless as ever. But for Thomas and Jean, the final push had been made. They had faced death, betrayal, and fear, and emerged, however scarred, determined to keep fighting, to keep surviving, and to keep hope alive in the shadow of history.